Okay, now that we have worked with basic HTML tags, and I showed you the block elements and inline elements, some of them, and you can study a lot more about these informations online from the web link that I gave you earlier this week and also last week. Here I want to talk a little bit about more advanced design features in HTML, and I'll start with tables, and I will finish this week's class on the tables, and next week we work with more advanced features in terms of formatting, styles, cascading style sheets, possibly we get into talking about frames a little bit, and then we go on to programming ASP. Now, tables. We can actually use tables in so many different ways, and sometimes even some designers would design their entire pages as tables. And tables are powerful tools in terms of organizing and visually grouping together groups of data that are related. And as I said, we could use the tables to design our entire page, have rows and columns representing each and every portion of the page that we see. Or we could use tables just simply to represent tabular data. And I'll show you today how we could do this. The table, of course, can be added to your document by a table tag. And the table tag contains two tags inside: the table row, which is a TR tag, and the table data, which is a TD tag, which you will put it inside the table rows. And I'll show you in the next slide how it works. But basically, your table contains several attributes, and some of these attributes, some of the most important of these attributes, are listed here. The first attribute is a summary, and it provides a summary of tables' purpose and structure for the users who do not have visual media. So, for example, if a user agent is basically using voice or speech synthesizer to speak out the table, the summary would just talk about it. You can think of it as a caption for the table. The align property or align attribute allows you to specify the position of your table with respect to the document. It is deprecated, and in newer versions of HTML and XHTML, we use styles to accomplish this. So the but if you're using transitional and frame set XHTMLs, you could still use this document. I mean, these attributes. The possible values are left, that puts your table to the left of the document; center, that centers your table within the document; and right, which makes or flushes the table all the way to the right of the document. The width attribute is essentially an attribute that allows you to specify the width of your table. You could either use it as percentage values, or you could use it as just pixel values. If you use percentage values, it would be calculated with respect to the size of the window. By default, it is 100%. And the table also has another attribute called border, which we will work with a little bit when I'm designing some tables. Now here's how your table element would look like. The table would be defined by your table tag, table opening, and / table closing tags. Within your table, you might have several table rows. So each row starts with a TR tag and ends with a /TR tag, closing tag. And within each row you may have several data cells, and each of them will be within the TD for opening and /TD for closing tag for your tables. Okay, now I'll just create a simple table, and I'll show you how each of those attributes and elements would affect the design of this table. After the first paragraph, let's just create a clear line, a new line, and then let's add the table tag. And within this table, let's add one row, and within this row, let's add two table three table cells. And let's see how this is rendered in our browser. So and just add so the table that you can see here is basically composed of this three cells, cell 1, cell 2, cell 3. However, it doesn't look like a table, and that is because I didn't define the border for my table. So what I can do is that I can go ahead and for the table add a border, and the border property 1, and as you can see, for each of the cells it had created basically the border type 1 for each of the cells in the table. Let's play with the border. So if you make border 2, the borders are a little bit wider, and if you make the border 5, the border becomes even thicker for the table. In terms of the width of the table, I could either define it in pixel numbers, so it became a little bit wider. Let's make the width 450. So now you see the table in total is 450 pixels wide, and I could make it with respect to the size of the window and make it 50% of the window size. And if I save and I show it, you can see that the table is basically half the window size. This is half, and this is the other half. Now let's align our table. Let's align the table center Here's the table that is aligned center, or I could align it to the right of the window, and the browser would automatically align our table to the right. Now let's move the table to center and make its width, its border 2, and let's add another row, and I could copy and paste the data and just change the values for the cells. Okay. Now we could also specify the width of the cells individually and the height of the rows individually. and this would affect the way that our cells would look like within the table. If we design, for example, the one of the rows to essentially contain 30% of the table, for example, here I would make the width of the first cell in the second row to be, let's say, 50% of the table. Then, as you see, when I run this this website, the first cell of the second row contains 50% of the table, and the other two share the rest of the rest of the 50%. However, notice that the first cell in the first row also contained 50% of 50% of the table. So that's important to consider when we are basically designing the width and height of our tables, our table cells individually, and we have to make sure that we understand what the impact of our sizing will be with respect to the entire table. Now, one quick note again in terms of sizing individual tables. Notice that I changed the size of the second row, the first cell in the second row, 50% of the table. And if I were to make the first cell of the first row 25% of the table, and I were to run this table, notice that no change happened, and the largest number 1. So the first column, which consists of the first cell in first row and second row, had two different sizes for each of these cells, and the one with the largest won and made it basically dictated the size of the other cells within that column. Now let's make the first cell 75% and the first cell of the second row 50%. Let's see what happens here. My intuition is that this row will win over and make both cells basically to become 50%, 75% of the table. And as you see, both cells now, the first and the second cell, contain 75% of the share of this cell or the table. Now let's make the width equal and here we have now the cells share equally 1/3 of the table. Alright, in terms of managing the borders of the table, we could the border that the table uses is essentially for the entire table, but we could use some attributes that are basically frame attributes and rule attributes of the table in order to either show the outside border of the entire table, or eliminate the outside border, or make the outside border just to be visible for top, bottom, left hand side, right hand side, horizontal sides, or vertical sides of the table border, and these are essentially the frames, the frame attributes for the table. There are also rule attributes that allow us control how the grid lines of your cells within the table will be represented, and they are essentially again either table-wise or row or column-wise. And those attributes are the rules for columns that show only vertical lines, the rules for rows that show only horizontal lines, the rules for groups that separate groups of data in a table. And in that sense, each of the defined group within the table are also tables themselves. we could put none, and that would essentially does not show any borders for the cells within the table, so you would see only a box around the table. And finally, you could have all, that shows all the grid lines for your table. So let's create these within our the table that we already created. I'll also show you the caption tag that allows me to put the caption for the table. So let's first add the caption to the table. For the caption, for example, let's say that we put table rules for all cells. And here within the table I add the attribute rules and I make it equal all. Now let's run this. As you see, the caption is added to the table, and all of the cells have borders assigned to them. If I add an enter or a new line at the end of the caption will be separated a little bit from the table. Okay, now let's make the attribute only for columns. So make this calls, and here we save the table, and as you see, only the columns have border values. Probably border values are small and can't be quite seen. Or we can make it into rows. And now as you see, only rows will have borders between them. We can add none as the result, and the cells within the table are not separated by rulers, and this essentially makes the table look like everything is within a box. And this is useful if you're designing your table, not just show tabular data, but rather design or graphically and visually put groups of data together, but you don't want to have the lines that would separate your data. For example, if I wanted to put this a web page in a table, that would have one big cell at the top containing the header for this page, and I would want to have a column to the left that had the say menu bars, and then in the middle I would want to have a cell that contained the body of my text. I could make this separation with the table and use these rules and frame sets in order just not to show the separation or the separators of the table cells, and therefore I would see a page just looking like a page, not separated like a table, but still I could group data within each of these cells efficiently together. Okay, now let's give a specific color to our border with the border color tag. So if I make the border color blue here, and I go and look at my border, you see that the border has been for the cells and for the entire table has been set to blue. And this makes it easier to see in terms of frames and rules. Now if I want to take out the outside border of the table, I could use the frame value, and from the list that the IntelliSense will give me, it's all the options that I can have the frame of the table only to be shown on top of the table and at the bottom of the table, and the border of the table to be just like a box, all of the sides to be to have frames, horizontal sides, basically top and bottom, left hand side, which is just the left side, right hand side, which is the right side of the table, void, that means that no frames, and vertical sides, which shows me both left and right side of the table. So let's have it vertical sides, or V sides. And if I do this, my table look like this. So I will have lines or frames just for the two vertical sides of my table. If I make it horizontal side, my table will only have the frame at the top and at the bottom. If I make it below, it will only show the frame at the bottom of the cell. And if I make it void, I will not have any frames around my table, and I will have only cells, cell borders. And cell borders are essentially the rules that I was talking about earlier. So let's make this box, and it shows the box around the table as the frame. And let's play now with the rules again. So rules can be all, can be columns, can be groups, can be none, can be rows. Let's make rules none, and here all of the interior cell borders are gone. If I make it into calls, then I will have only separators for columns. If I make it into rows, I'll have only the row separators. Let's make another row by copying and pasting one of these rows. And as you see, I will have only separators between the rows. If I had different types of row groups, I could make the rows rules to be groups, and then it would just show the rules within between separate groups. So if I make rules all, then I will have rules for all of the cells within my table. I will not talk about nested tables, but essentially nested tables are when you put tables within tables. So imagine that you have a table as an outside table. You have a big table element, and within you have a table row, and then you have table data cells. If you use within each of those table data sets another table element, then you could nest your tables together, and each of the cells will become its own table, and you can control their rules, their paddings, and their frames for each table within the cells. Now let's talk about the padding and spacing of data for either the entire table or each cell. Depending on the contents of a particular cell, we can have spaces between the borders and the contents of the cell. The space between the borders and the contents are essentially called cell paddings, and you can have different types of or different sizes for the padding of for the padding between the contents of different tables and their borders. The cell padding is only set for the attribute of the table element. So you can set the padding for the entire table, and it would affect all of the cells within the table. So you can't have different paddings for individual cells. Let me put an image in the first cell of the table, and let's have the image of the desert that I created earlier. So here it is. My image is now inside the first cell, and it is basically, it starts right after the cell border ended. If I want to have this image a little bit apart from the borders of the table, I could use the padding for the table. So gonna cell padding equal to, and this will take the image about 2 pixels away from the border of the table. Now it may not look large enough. Let's make it 20, and this hopefully will separate the table, the content, which is this image, from the table border about 20 pixels from both the left and the right hand side and the upper side, and that affects the contents of the texts within the other cells as well. As you can see here, now each of these texts within the cells are essentially 20 pixels away from their closest borders. Now cell spacing is a little different. The cell spacing of the table would, instead of determining the amount of space between the contents of the table and the borders, it determines the space between the cells in the table. So let's just work with the cell spacing a little bit. Okay, now let's look at our table. This looks like this. Let me take the rules out. So here I have each cell with its own border, and as you see, the contents of the cell are 20 pixels padded or away from the borders of the entire table. Now, if the cells are basically pretty much close to each other. Now let's make the cell spacing a little more. Cell spacing equals 5. Now notice this was the table without the cell spacing, and here the table with 5 pixels of cell spacing. So as you see, the cells are now separated a little bit more from each other. If I make this 15 pixels, the cell spacings, or the gaps between the cells, become wider. And if I make it even more, let's change the padding to 5, and let's make this spacing to 25. Now the contents get closer to the borders, but the cells become farther apart. And here's how the cell would look like, or the table would look like in this case. Okay, and I have two final notes on the tables, and that would conclude the table attribute within the HTML tags. The first is about alignment of rows and cells of the table, which is different than alignment of the table. And the next and the final topic I want to talk about is the spanning of the rows and columns of your table. Now let's move to our document, our web page, and I'll show you how they work. Alright, now look at our table, and this is the entire table once more. I have the table tag that tells me that the table is aligned at the center of the page and is 50% of the page size. Its border is 3, its border color is blue, its frame is box, so all of the 4 sides of the table have frames around them, and the cell padding is 5, meaning that the content of the cells are 5 pixels away from the borders of the cells, and cell spacing is 5, meaning that the cells are 5 pixels separated from each other. The table has 2 rows, which are basically defined by these TR tags, and the table has 3 columns within each row, and they are defined by these TD tags. So let me just align a little bit my my elements so they would look near. And here we are. I have 3 rows, and each row has 3 columns. Let's take a look at the table one more time and see how it looks like. So here's how the table looks like. 3 columns, 3 rows, each of the TR elements, and each of them will have 3 cells, which are the TD elements. Now, first thing about the alignment of the contents of cells themselves. Now, there is the align attribute for the tables that I could put in the TR tag, and that would align the text or the images within the entire row with respect to the vertical sides of the cells. So I could use the tab, the attribute align. I have center, left, and right. Of course, justify as justifies the table. Justifies the text. Now let's align the table and center them. And as you see, by default, every content of the cells are aligned, are left aligned. Now if I center the alignment tag within the TR tag, all of the cell contents within the first row became centered. I could change the alignment to right also, and it would justify them to the right, would align them to the right of the cells in the entire row. I could override one or more of these cells by changing the attributes of the TD element, and let's make this one center. So this will make the first cell centered, and the rest of the cells in the first row become right aligned. And here's how it looks like. I can make the second row alignment left, and if I had multiple lines within the row, I would use justify if I needed to have them justified, either to the left or the right. So the first alignment so the entire row alignment is right. The first alignment for the first cell in the first row has been overridden to center. The alignment of the second element in the first row has been overridden to left, and the alignment for the rest of the elements or the cells in that row would remain unaffected. There is another alignment that can be used for the vertical positioning of your table, and that is the v-align attribute. There are 4 values for this attribute. Baseline, we should avoid it because browsers react differently to this, and I always use bottom, middle, or top. So if you want your texts to be aligned on top of vertically from the top of your from the top of your cells, you use v-align top equal top, and when you run this, you see that your image is aligned from the top, and so did the contents, the text within the other cells. Now if I want to override the alignment for the cells individually, I could do so. So let's go and make the alignment of the second or the third cell bottom and make the second one middle point alignment. And here's how it looks like. So that's the alignment of the contents of your tables. One final topic is the topic of spanning rows and columns. Sometimes you may have tables that you need to, if you remember from document processing like or editing softwares like Microsoft Word, you can create tables and then you can merge cells together to create a cell that spans over multiple rows or multiple columns. We could use this, we could do this for with the tables here by using the row span and col span of attributes of the TD tag. Let me clean up these alignments and then I'll show you how these column span and row span work. Okay, I cleaned up the alignments and now let's run the table. So again, everything is now back to default, so they are horizontally aligned from the left and vertically aligned in the middle of the cells. Now let's look at this picture and let's assume that this picture is a picture that spans for more than one column. Basically, let's have this cell, the first cell with the picture, and the cell that sells cell 2. Let's merge these two cells together and create a cell that basically overlooks two columns or two other cells. So how can we do this? Now notice when one cell spans more than one column or one row, the number of the number of extra cells within that row plus the number of rows that this cell spans should be equal to the total number of rows in the table. Otherwise the table would look weird, and I'll show you how it looks like. The same is true for columns. So if one cell spans more than one column, then the number of columns that it spans over plus the number of remaining columns within that row should equal the total number of the columns in the table. Now here, for the first row, I have 3 columns basically, which are these 3 TD elements, 1, 2, and 3. Now, if I were to merge columns 1 and 2 together, then if I just simply put the col span equal 2 for the first column, I would end up having 4 columns in the first row and 3 columns in the rest of the table. So for doing so, I would have to take out the second column. Now, as it stands, my table in the first row has 2 columns and it has 3 columns in the rest of this the table, and I can make the number of columns that the first row spans over equal 2. This way I can merge the first 2 columns and it would be basically above the first 2 columns in the other rows. Now let's see how it looks like. So what I did is that I took out cell 2 and then I made cell 1's size to be equal to the first 2 columns of the row, or essentially the first 2 columns of the table. And here's how it looks like. So my first column is now exactly the same size as the total size of the other 2 columns that are presented underneath here. And the third cell basically stays the same. Let's make the alignment of the first column center, and here's how it looks like. Now let's assume that I want this. Okay, let's take the column span out, and let's get back our our table together. Now let's assume that I want to merge the first cells of the first two rows together. I need to take out the new values 1 TD tag, and then make the row span of the first row equal 2. This way, this cell spans over the first two rows of the table, and the rest of the table stays intact. In order to do so, I'd have to take out the first element of the second row. Now, notice that my second row has only two elements. And what I need to do is to make the row span of the first TD equal 2. So that means that this column has been taken out, and the first column is now, its size is now equal to the first two rows of the cell or the table. And here's how it looks like. So this way I had merged the first two rows of the first column. Now finally, if I wanted to merge not only the first two rows but also the first two columns, I could do so by taking out the second columns of both rows and columns. So I take out this element, which is cell 2, and then I take out new value 2 as well. And I make the column span of the table equal 2. Now the first cell is equal in size to 4 cells, 2 rows and 2 columns, and this is how it looks like. So it actually devoured the other 3 cells, and it now represents the 4 of them. Now if I had not taken out, for example, cell 2, my table would have been messed up like this. Because cell 2 exists, but the total number of the rows and columns that this cell spans over is now more than the total number that were allowed within the table. Okay, this concludes the introduction to HTML and the basics of HTML, I finish up here, and all the information and the materials are online on the Blackboard. So that you have finished this this lecture, the information about the tags and elements and attributes that I talked about today, I have put them online as a further reading materials. So please go ahead and read them and use these the attributes and elements that we studied today and create websites and get yourself familiar with these topics in the HTML if you are not already. Next week I will finish up the HTML, and hopefully I'll talk a lot about cascading style sheets. The rest of the learning about the HTML is easy online materials, and so you just if you need any information, you can find them from a variety of different sources online. And then we move on to ASP, and we work with server-side programming. And hopefully at some point in time I'll get to talk a little bit about JavaScript and client-side programming as well, and then we can finally put big projects that basically spread the processing in both client and server sides with scripting codes and active server pages languages. and we can finally create websites that are reasonable and visually appealing and easy to use. So thank you very much for attending this lecture, and I hope that it was informative and you enjoyed it, and I will be looking forward to talking to you next week in the fourth installment of this class. Have a good week.